This lecture is on the economics of political entrepreneurship. And I guess why I'm talking about this, I wrote an article on this in the old review of Austrian Economics a long time ago, probably about 12 or 13 years ago anyway. And sort of the theme of it was that there seemed to be in the economics literature of public choice, the use of this word entrepreneurship a little too closely to the way it's used in markets. And it's a big problem that Austrians have had with this alternative, more or less libertarian school of thought, public choice, in that it too often models the state or government as like a firm, like a business firm, and makes analogies to markets and politics being essentially the same thing. I think Walter Block in his session on critiques of public choice, I'm sure he'll cover that because he and I have published on that. But that's how I got interested in talking about and writing about political entrepreneurship and distinguishing it from real market entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship on the free market. And in fact, I've written 3 or 4 books about this general area, political entrepreneurship. They're not called political entrepreneurship, but there are various aspects of it. And so I think the first thing I'd like to do is read a pretty decent definition of a real market entrepreneur. And this comes from a non-Austrian, former colleague of mine, Bob Tollefson, who is familiar with Austrian literature, especially Israel Kirzner's work on the economics of entrepreneurship. It's if you're interested in this general topic, his book Competition and Entrepreneurship is an excellent book, and it's for sale downstairs. And about entrepreneur, he says this: when competition is viewed as a dynamic, value-creating, evolutionary process, that's the Austrian view of competition, the role of economic rents in stimulating entrepreneurial decisions and in prompting an efficient allocation of resources is crucial. Profit-seeking in a competitive market order is a normal feature of economic life. The returns of resource owners will be driven to normal levels by competitive profit-seeking, as some resource earners earn positive rents which promote entry, and others earn negative rents which cause exit. Profit-seeking and economic rents are inherently related to the efficiency of the competitive market process. Such activities drive the competitive price system and create value, that is, new products, in the economy. And that's a pretty good statement of the Austrian view of entrepreneurship and its role in the market economy and of profits and losses. Entrepreneurship is what creates value in the economy. And the theme of what I've written about this is that political entrepreneurship is what destroys value in the economy. It just does just the opposite, precisely because it diverts effort away from value creation, creation of new products, improvement of products, price cutting. Effort is drawn away from that toward influencing politics, having laws, regulations passed that simply put more money into the pocket of the lobbyist or the political entrepreneur in return for nothing for the consumer. And as I mentioned yesterday in my talk, as some of you were here, this is referred to as rent-seeking in the economics literature. I like to call it plunder-seeking, as opposed to profit-seeking. The whole purpose of profit seekers are successful if they create value in the economy, if they create wealth, if they enlarge the size of the economic pie, if you will. Rent seekers or plunder seekers, they're profitable if they can take money out of the pocket of one group of people and put it into the pocket of their own pocket, and that's all zero sum at best. At best, it's robbing Peter to pay Paul. In fact, it's worse than that, because the opportunity cost of all this effort spent trying to secure a wealth transfer as opposed to wealth creation is foregone production. We're not producing things. We're spending time politicking. And so that's I think that's a good way of thinking of political versus market entrepreneurs. And as von Mises wrote in Human Action, it's useful to think of everyone as an entrepreneur, a potential entrepreneur. It's not just a business person. Consumers can be entrepreneurial. Workers can be entrepreneurial. They can innovate. They can move from job to job by being alert to opportunities that arise for them. So it's consumers, workers, business people. Everybody can be entrepreneurial. It's not just business people. And in the context of political entrepreneurship, I just want to talk about two kinds. One is the business person who is a political entrepreneur who seeks to plunder his neighbors. Of course, there's always some sort of camouflage. There's always some sort of big barrage of lies that has to be told. And the lies are usually told by someone called the publicist or the K Street lobbyist. That's who's hired to tell the lies about why robbing the Treasury is really a good thing, or why paying higher prices for your cars is really good for you. Okay, that's Buy America, for example. A lot of people are sort of snowed over by Buy America rhetoric, and it makes them feel good about being ripped off when they buy their next new car, to some people. And so that's a lot of what happens. And so, and there's a great little book it's downstairs in the library, and I don't know if it's for sale here. It's kind of weird because it has two different titles. I think the first edition was Entrepreneurs versus the State, and the author is Burton Folsom. I'll write this down in case you want to look him up. Oops. Folsom is how he spells his name. And the second edition of it was published as The Myth of the Robber Barons. And this idea that I just mentioned of this distinction between political entrepreneurs and market entrepreneurs is the main theme of this whole book. And it's not a real big book, but he does a great job at this. And I thought I can't really do much better than give you some of his very clear examples of political entrepreneurship by business people. I'm going to talk about politicians per se in a minute. And there's one chapter of this book that's my favorite. It's on the building of the American transcontinental railroads in the 19th century. And he contrasts the political entrepreneurs were the men who ran and profited by the government-subsidized railroads that were begun during the American Civil War in the Lincoln administration. And then he contrasts that with one of the great American free market entrepreneurs, James J. Hill, who built a transcontinental railroad from the Midwest to the West Coast without a penny in government subsidies, not even a land grant, whereas the subsidized roads had literally tens of millions of acres in land grant, free land that they were given under the Homestead Act. It wasn't given to homesteaders as much as it was given to railroad corporations, mining corporations, timber corporations, and so forth. But just listen to what he writes about the political entrepreneurs in the railroad building business. He refers to a man named Grenville Dodge here, and Grenville Dodge was a close personal friend of Abraham Lincoln's. And during the Civil War, he was made a military officer, and he spent a lot of time surveying, making plans for the railroad that was going to be built to California. And then after the war, he was made the chief engineer of the building of the transcontinental railroads. And he says this: the rush for subsidies caused many building problems. Nebraska winters were long and hard, but since Dodge was in a hurry, he laid track on the ice and snow anyway. Naturally, the line had to be rebuilt in the spring. It's the kind of thing you can do when it's government money and it's not your money. It was actually profitable because if you built tracks on top of 5 feet of ice and then the spring thaw comes and the tracks collapsed, you just get more money from the government. So no problem. He said, what is worse, unanticipated spring flooding along the loop fork of the Platte River washed out rails, bridges, and telephone poles, doing at least $50,000 damage the first year. Then he goes, by pushing rail lines through unsettled land, the transcontinentals invited Indian attacks, which caused the loss of hundreds of lives and further ran up the cost of building. So it was beginning to be quite the mess. And he started out by saying, the subsidies shaped all this. The subsidies shaped the Union Pacific, was the name of the rail line, builder's strategy in the following ways. They moved west from Omaha in 1865 along the Platte River. Since they were being paid by the mile, they sometimes built winding, circuitous roads to collect for more mileage. And so So what was going on was they said, okay, we'll pay you by the mile to build these railroads. So here's Minnesota. Say you're building a railroad, and here's San Francisco. Here's the West Coast. Here's Canada, which I call Canuckistan. Okay, and so normally there might have been a way through the Rocky Mountains like this, but if you're being paid these subsidies, this is pretty much the route that they took, because you're being paid a per mile subsidy. So why not? You let the good times roll. It's somebody else's money, and so. For construction, they used cheap and light wrought iron rails, soon to be outmoded by Bessemer steel rails. And Thomas Durant, vice president and general manager, stressed speed, not workmanship. And so I've written about this in my Lincoln book, and I mentioned Durant. I got an email from the great-great-great-grandson of Thomas Durant, who seemed to agree that his ancestor was a scoundrel. Not great-great, must have been two greats in there. Okay, some other examples of this. After the construction was completed of these government-subsidized railroads, many were astonished at the cost. The Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, these are the two government-subsidized railroads, even with 44 million acres of free land and over $61 million in cash low-interest loans, they were almost bankrupt by the time they finished it. And to see what kind of shenanigans the great railroad barons were up to, the Central Pacific was run by what was known as the Big Four. Leland Stanford, the founder of Stanford University, Collis Huntington, Charles Crocker, and Mark Hopkins, the Big Four. And Stanford was a particularly sleazy scoundrel, in my view, and a genuine robber baron. He deserves the name robber baron. Folsom writes this: Stanford, who was elected governor and U.S. Senator of California, controlled the politics for the Big Four. That was his job. He wasn't particularly good as an engineer, but he was a senator and a governor, so he controlled the politics. Now, what does this mean? Well, he, quote, prevented any competing railroad from entering California. So they had laws passed making it illegal to compete in California. Now, that's how to make money. Get laws passed making competition illegal. And then he goes on to say, the Big Four escaped jail because the records of the contract and finance company, quote, accidentally were destroyed. And so, it was 1900 before the privately funded railroads could compete. And there's a book about these Big Four called The Octopus that was written in the early 20th century. Famous book about them. Now contrast that to Hill, James J. Hill, who built the Great Northern. Here's what this is the final thing I'm going to read from Folsom. As Hill built his railroad across from the Midwest, from Minnesota, he was from Minnesota to the West Coast. He followed a consistent strategy. This is a market entrepreneur. First, he always built slowly and developed the export of the area before he moved further west. In the Great Plains, this export was wheat, and Hill promoted dry farming to increase wheat yields. He advocated diversifying crops and imported 7,000 cattle from England and elsewhere, handing them over free of charge to settlers near his line. Hill was a pump primer. He knew that if the farmers prospered, their freight would give him a steady returns every year. The key was to get people to come to the Northwest. To attract immigrants, Hill offered to bring them out to the Northwest for a mere $10 each if they would farm near his railroad. And they quote Hill as saying, "You are now our children, but we are in the same boat with you, and we will have got to prosper with you, or we have got to be poor with you." End quote. To make sure they prospered, he even set up his own experimental farms to test new seed, livestock, and equipment. He promoted crop rotation, mixed farming, and the use of fertilizers. Finally, he sponsored contests and awarded prizes to those who raised meaty livestock or grew abundant wheat. And so the emphasis was all on efficiency with Hill. It was his own money. He was a private entrepreneur. And if he had cost overruns, he went bankrupt. And so, and you read about him, if you read about how he even discovered the route that was discovered by Lewis and Clark in 1803 through the Rockies and cut over 100 miles off his road. You read his biography. He even would get out there and work with the guys pounding spikes into the railroad lines if they were taking coffee breaks, so they could take coffee breaks and things like that. He was. I've known some businessmen in my life that are kind of like this. That are entrepreneurs. They started up their own business, and there's no rock left unturned. They just devote their lives to just every detail of their business, and that's why they're successful. They're really driven people. And Hill, if you read about Hill, he was like that. He was an amazingly brilliant and driven man. And in his autobiography, Hill wrote this. He says, "Our own line in the North was built without any government aid and even the right-of-way through hundreds of miles of public lands being paid for by cash." And so he was not a political entrepreneur at all, and he was very proud of the fact that he did not take a penny from the taxpayer or anybody else. And he, of course, despised the political entrepreneurs that he competed with. But at one point, they were most of them went bankrupt, the government-subsidized railroads, because of this sort of thing. This was very expensive, and every time they would run into a problem, cost overruns, Congress would pass a new law requiring them to check with Congress before you make another decision to extend the rail line somewhere or something, so that it got so that to make a business decision required an act of Congress, and no business could run like that. And so, and that was to Hill's benefit. That was to Hill's benefit. And but they finally got back at Hill for outcompeting. He outcompeted the government-subsidized railroads for many decades, and then after the turn of the century, they sued Hill for violating the antitrust laws, and it was the first successful federal antitrust lawsuit was against James J. Hill under the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed in 1890. So the state got its revenge. But I recommend this book. It's a good examples of business people as political entrepreneurs and the consequences of that, and the stark contrast between them and real market entrepreneurs. Okay. Now, what I have to say about politicians as political entrepreneurs, there have been a few articles in the literature in economics looking at politicians, comparing politicians as entrepreneurs to market entrepreneurs, in sort of a benevolent light, where a political entrepreneur, as a politician, will find ways to improve the quality of public services or to cut taxes and things like that, just like a market entrepreneur will find ways to improve his product and cut the cost to compete. And you can cite some examples of politicians who have been pretty decent. A few years ago, there was this mayor of Jersey City, New Jersey, who a lot of libertarians liked. Schindler was his name, Schindler, I think, who privatized quite a few things. They had a horrible water problem, couldn't drink the water, so he just contracted out with private companies and let them fix the water problem. And he seemed to do a lot of good things. So you do find some examples of that. But I think it's the phenomenon where the exception makes the rule, that in general a political entrepreneur as a politician is somebody who is very clever, conniving, and even diabolical in isolating himself from control by the public. By not being controlled by the public, by pursuing his own self-interest, which is rarely in the same self-interest as the typical citizen, as the average citizen. And politicians spend enormous amounts of time figuring out ways to avoid being responsible to the public, to avoid giving the public what it wants. After all, if you think of most of what government does, who said they wanted all this stuff? All this stuff that we supposedly get or pay for the government, there's no market for it. They just give it to us whether we want it or not. A classic example would be, I remember the election of when Bill Clinton got elected, there was no mention at all of health care during the campaign. But as soon as he got in office, all of a sudden, they're going to impose a 15% payroll tax and nationalize the medical care industry. Where did that come from? They didn't succeed, but that's the kind of thing we get in politics quite a lot. And as I said, I've written several books about this phenomenon of political entrepreneurs going to tremendous lengths to isolate themselves from the voters, to be just the opposite of a real entrepreneur who caters to his customers. Politicians do the opposite. They plunder their customers and by isolating themselves. And one book I wrote, it was my first book about 115 years ago. Actually, it was only 1983. It wasn't almost 115 years ago. It's called Underground Government, the Off-Budget Public Sector was the title of it, co-authored with James Bennett. This is back when I was at George Mason, back in those days. And it's about how this was at the end of the era of the tax revolt in America. In the late 70s, there was a tax revolt, not just in California, but in several dozen states, where states had passed constitutional amendments or laws limiting taxes, state and local borrowing, spending limits. Quite a few places now still have these spending limits where, or tax limits that say that the property tax, for example, can't go up more than 2% a year or something like that. And this was all the result of the tax revolt of the 70s. And so we started asking ourselves, well, how are governments going to respond to this? The public is demanding tax relief, the control of spending, and the control of debt. Are the politicians going to act like entrepreneurs and give the customer what he wants? That's what an entrepreneur do. Or are they going to try to weasel their way around it? And of course, we were highly suspicious that they would in fact weasel their way around it. And we found that, well, they had a track record of doing this for over 100 years in the United States and in quite a few other countries too. And so we wrote this whole book about what we called off-budget enterprises. In England, they were called quangos, quasi-autonomous non-government organizations, something like Quango was the acronym. But we call them OBEs. And I'll give you just one example of how this works, where voters would vote again and again against something, against some proposal to raise taxes, to spend some sort of money. And the politician would say, well, okay, the people have spoken. This is a democracy. We'll do what you want. We won't spend the money on this thing. But then they'll turn right around, leave the door, go out the door, and get together with some sleazeball lawyers. And in New York State, the sleazeball lawyer turned out to be John Mitchell, who was Nixon's Attorney General later. This is in 1960s and 70s, early 70s, and figure out a way to spend money without voter approval. Now, when they issued debt in America, in the state and local governments, to build university dormitories or something like that at the state level, it's called general obligation debt. And one of the things it means is the debt becomes the general obligation of the taxpayers. And so it requires a vote, up or down, a referendum usually in a lot of states. They devised a new gimmick with a form of what is called a revenue bond. And what a revenue bond is debt can be issued by governments without voter approval by merely making a promise that we're going to build this dormitory, let's say, at a state university, and then the rent that we charge will take in enough revenue to pay off the principal and interest on the debt. Promise. And of course, it never works out that way. But let me read to you how Nelson Rockefeller, the former governor of New York State, was the master of this whole kind of scheme. And I'm just quoting myself here from my book. After voters had 3 times rejected a housing bond issue for $100 million, Governor Rockefeller created the Housing Finance Authority, which issued large amounts of revenue bond debt. At one point, such debt exceeded the entire voter-approved debt of the state. In 1961, voters rejected a $500 million bond issue on higher education for the 4th time. 4th time. Consequently, Rockefeller created the off-budget State University Construction Authority and issued the debt anyway. In 1965, after the voters rejected a housing bond issue for the 5th time, Rockefeller created the Urban Development Corporation, did the same thing. By 1975, 81% of the total outstanding debt of New York State was non-voter approved, non-guaranteed debt of these off-budget enterprises, and the state was effectively bankrupt. They effectively bankrupted New York State. It had to get a federal bailout, as did New York City at the same time. And they created something in New York City called Big Mac. MAC was the acronym for a Municipal Assistance Corporation. And it was just a way to funnel tax dollars into these bankrupted off-budget enterprises that promised that they would never need subsidies, that they were the revenue that they would earn would pay for all the debt. And so in the early 80s, the biggest default in the history of municipal finance in America took place in the Northwest. And there was a big nuclear power plant construction project that was known as WHOOPS. And the acronym was WPPSS, stood for the Washington Public Power Supply System. And it was all funded by this off-budget, non-voter approved debt. And you see, when it's non-voter approved, it didn't even show up on the budgets of the state or local governments that issue this debt. So it's harder for people to get an idea of what's going on, what their liabilities are, and it just gave the politicians a huge pot of money to spend with much less accountability than they would normally have if they had to face the voters on these things, which they never did. And Whoops defaulted on $2.5 billion in debt at the time. I think one of the power plants was eventually built maybe 15 years later, but they ended up dismantling 4 partially built nuclear power plants that they spent about 20 years working on. Quite a disaster.
Did the bondholders just eat that loss?
What's that?
Did the bondholders?
Yeah, oh yeah, a lot of bondholders really ate this loss. I remember giving a presentation on this at the Cato Institute around that time when it was all happening, because I've been writing a lot of Wall Street Journal articles. I wrote about this, and the person that was on the podium with me was Felix Rohatyn, who was one of the champions of the Big Mac, the Municipal Assistance Corporation, and I can recall him defending this, and Ed Crane, who was the president of the Cato at the time and still is, I remember him standing up and saying that, well, Mr. Rohatyn must own a lot of Whoops bonds, because he was passionately defending a bailout, a government bailout of Whoops. Yeah, they just ate it. They just. What is?
You buy these type of bonds, and you're taking a big chance.
Yeah, the only problem is the taxpayers are on the hook for a couple of billion, which is not the ideal libertarian thing, I guess. But so that's the sort of thing. This sort of thing goes on at the federal level too. There's something called the Federal Financing Bank that I learned about 20 some years ago. It is kind of a nice scheme. I actually interviewed a guy that ran it. It was at the time I had a friend who worked in the Treasury Department in D.C., and it was like one little door in the Treasury building, one little office about the size of Jeff Tucker's office down the hall here, and they would issue debt, and money would be printed by the Fed, and the Treasury would issue this money to government agencies, and they would spend billions. Tens of billions in the Agriculture Department, the Defense Department, all the different agencies of the federal government, and this would not appear on the budget as spending. And so you would literally have tens of billions of dollars being spent that were not counted as part of the budget or the deficit or anything like that. But these were loans to government agencies, and if in some future year the government agency paid back part of the loan anyway, the payback was counted as a reduction in the debt or the deficit for that year. So the end result was, even though the government was actually spending more, the accounts that were published, the official published budget, made it look like it was spending less, because or the deficit, or at least the deficit didn't look as big as it would. And so, and again, it was less accountable. They did not hold congressional hearings over appropriations for these federal financing bank spending. So it was a different kind of subterfuge. And of course, the federal government in the U.S. spends hundreds of billions a year on guaranteed loans, which is basically a loan that says if the borrower defaults, the taxpayers will pay for it. And so therefore, since the risk is close to zero, it's a lower interest loan. It's a preferred borrower. And so if you get one of these loans, like a student loan, it's like that, from the federal government, what it does is it reallocates credit, capital, to politically preferred borrowers and away from alternative uses in the market economy. And so it politicizes debt, in other words. And so that's one example I wanted to offer of political entrepreneurship, whereby politicians have devised, and this had been going on, we write in our book, for well over 100 years in the U.S., almost as soon as people began scrutinizing local governments, almost as soon as local governments became pretty substantial in doing things, doing garbage collection and sewer, water purification, things like that, they began trying to isolate themselves from the government. Another example of this phenomenon of political entrepreneurship, politicians essentially thumbing their noses at the voters while making speeches about the wonders of democracy, is another book I published with Bennett called Destroying Democracy, and the subtitle was How Government Funds Partisan Politics. And the title Destroying Democracy we got from James Madison in the Federalist Papers, number 10, essay number 10, where he wrote that historically governments that did not control the violence of faction, by which he meant special interest groups, have everywhere perished. That if you don't control democracy, in other words, if you don't control democracy, you're going to go to hell, politically speaking. It'll destroy your country. Rent-seeking or plunder-seeking will run amok, and everyone will try to live at everyone else's expense, and that creates a great sense of injustice, for one thing, because it's political power that determines how the money gets spent, not justice or fairness, and it destroys the economy as well. He didn't write too much about the economy part of it, but it does reduce wealth in the economy. And so Madison said the whole purpose for having a constitution was to try to control democracy, by which he called the violence of faction. As Hans Hoppe said last night, the American founding fathers despised democracy. Contrary to the neocon propaganda that you hear today, we need to invade the entire planet in the name of democracy because that's the American way. No, it's not. It's the French Revolution way. That's not the American way. But that's where we got our title, Destroying Democracy, because the research we did in this book, and I can explain to you how we did the research, was to discover that the government, far from doing anything to restrain special interest groups, was actually spending well over $100 billion, even in the early 1980s, writing checks to special interest groups to finance their lobbying activities. Not only was it not restraining them, it was paying them. And it was sort of like paying somebody to twist your arm. And so the way it works is Congress and the executive branch allocate funds to all the various special interest groups, whether it's labor unions, environmentalist groups, the farm lobby, whoever, the whole gamut of special interest groups, under the guise of, if it's an environmental group, we're going to teach senior citizens how not to litter, let's say, something nice sounding, pleasant sounding like that. Okay, but much of the money would be used just for plain old politicking, lobbying for bigger government and for a bigger appropriation for the agency that gave them the money. And so we did Freedom of Information Act requests of every government agency and got file cabinets full of data on who's getting all the money, who's getting all the grant money. And then we did research on who these people were and what they were doing with the money. And they would be very open about how they were spending the money in their annual reports and things like that. We even had a couple of graduate students at the time. And all these interest groups have offices in Washington, D.C., and they had a couple of graduate students. One was a guy with hair down to his waistline in the back, and the other, his hair was a little bit shorter, but even in the early 80s even, he was wearing earrings and wore sandals even in the wintertime. They looked like a couple of potheads. And they fit in perfectly with all these left-wing interest groups in D.C. So they would come strolling in there. We're students from George Mason University, and naturally they would look at them and say, "They're one of us." And they would give them all this information. Sure, they're writing, they're doing research, and they helped us a great deal in gathering all this stuff. But this is how it works: Congress and the executive branch give money to special interest groups. The special interest groups keep a lot for themselves, pay their own salaries, and do a few things that are quasi-legitimate, at least according to what their contract says. But then they spend at least half of it or more simply hiring lobbyists or lobbying themselves for bigger welfare spending, bigger environmental regulation, spending for the EPA and things like that. And that works. It works. It affects politics. And so the Congress has more money to play with. And so therefore it has more money next year to give to the same groups. The same groups do the same thing. They use the money to lobby. It works. The budget goes up. Some of the budget is shared again with the same groups, and it just goes on and on and on. And so what a scam. And of course that was the great fear of Madison, that interest groups would destroy democracy. And so which I guess libertarians would mostly say, well, that's a good thing, destroying democracy. I've had arguments with people about this book title. Why are you against destroying democracy? But it was just a play on Madison's words. And so that's how tax-funded politics works, and it still works today. My old friend Jim Bennett just wrote an updated version of this. About a year ago he published it on his own. And it's a pretty inexpensive book if anybody's interested in this topic. So that's example number 2, what I mean by political entrepreneurship. Example number 3 is another book I wrote with Bennett. It's out of print now, so I don't even think it's downstairs. It's called Official Lies, How Washington Misleads Us. And it's about the pervasive lying of government and how it can get away with it. And in comparison with the private sector, if a business person lies, well, customers who are lied to once are not likely to go back. If a business person tells you our hot dogs are 100% beef and you bite into it and it's soybean, you're not likely to go back. And the competitors of that business person have every incentive to point out that the hot dog is not in fact 100% beef. And so it doesn't really work very well. Fraudulent advertising never does work. In fact, it's counterproductive, because it's counterproductive to lie about your product. If you have a bad product and advertise heavily, you're going to piss a lot of people off, because they're going to try it out and then they're going to get ripped off, and they're going to tell anyone they know, if the subject comes up, don't go there. You know, they have this great ad, but boy, this food is terrible. Don't go to that restaurant. So that doesn't really work. You'll be fooled once maybe, but that's about it. But with government, government has a constant megaphone of information that's out there, and takes advantage of the fact that the average voter is what we call rationally ignorant. And this is a concept from public choice economics. Basically says that the average person spends most of his or her time accumulating knowledge about how to do their job, how to raise their family, how to get through school, how to pay the bills on time, all your personal things. And we really pay relatively little attention to social policy, especially with a government as big as ours. It's impossible for any one human mind to know but a tiny, tiny, minute fraction of what the government is up to. It's just physically impossible. Government takes advantage of this, takes advantage of it, because it knows this. And not only are most of us rationally ignorant of government and what it does, but much of what we do think we know is propaganda that is fed to us by government and all of its government-financed interest groups, from university professors to all these special interest groups. Joseph Schumpeter wrote about this in 1942 in his book Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. In one of the editions of it, he said this: human nature and politics being what it is, politicians are able to fashion, and within very wide limits, even to create the will of the people. What we are confronted with in the analysis of political processes is largely not a genuine, but a manufactured will. The will of the people is the product and not the motive power of the political process. And so, and this is what this other book is about this barrage of lies that we're constantly deluged with. Well, just look at the Iraq War right now. How many people apparently in America still believe in the weapons of mass destruction story, even though the Bush administration has admitted that has never happened. There never were any weapons of mass destruction or Al-Qaeda connections or anything, but they still somehow believe this. Maybe it's cognitive dissonance. But Just to give you a few examples of what we talk about in this book is of how the government lies to us. On the issue of welfare spending, the government statistics that are widely reported by the news media on income distribution and the inequality of income in America, cash or in-kind benefits that welfare recipients get are not counted in the government statistics. And so when you get government statistics on the distribution of income in America and how unequal it is and it's growing inequality, things like that, in some places, like in New York City, which is the high cost of living area, it's not unusual for somebody who's on welfare to get $30,000 to $40,000 a year worth of cash or in-kind benefits, child care allowance, and so forth, housing subsidies. I think Walter Block mentioned in his talk in the last session that there's public housing in Manhattan where people might pay $100 a month for a real estate that really on the free market would go for $10,000 a month because it's right in a desirable part of Manhattan. And so, that's a pretty big subsidy to live for $100 a month in a $10,000 a month area. And so those are not accounted as income, and taxes are not subtracted from the gross income of the higher income people. And so gross income is accounted as the income of the more affluent, but gross income of all kinds is not counted for the less affluent. And so therefore, of course, the income distribution the government reports to us looks much more unequal than it would otherwise be. And it also makes the poverty rate, the official government poverty rate, much higher. Because, if people on welfare are given $10,000 in cash, that's not counted. And so they're still considered to be in poverty, even if they have all these benefits. So that's one example. And environmental lies have been rampant and funded and subsidized by the government. Among the phony environmental scares, I just wrote down a list off the top of my head here: acid rain, asbestos, DDT, the hole in the ozone layer, which has always been there, global warming, global cooling, the fruit preservative alar, electromagnetic fields, cancer-causing cellular phones, supposedly. And my favorite, this comes from the Sierra Club, which got the Discovery Channel to air a television program about this, and the Sierra Club gets government money. A crisis of shrinking alligator penises caused by too much chlorine in the water. Honest to God, this has been a big. The Sierra Club made a big deal of this. I guess the implication is if we don't clean up the water, first the alligators and then us. And so no. This actually was the Sierra Club actually published a scientific study of this, and it was on television. And but you got to wonder who did the measuring. How kind of sample? How large was the sample of alligators, and what brave soul did they have to do the measuring? But it gets awfully wacky, doesn't it? The environmentalists' attempts to scare us with all these things, but they've succeeded. They've succeeded pretty much. I have a sister-in-law and a 4-year-old niece, and she reads all the women's magazines about child rearing and everything, and she's extremely conscientious, and she's scared to death to let her daughter go outside the yard almost. She can't play on the playground swings because she read somewhere that the chemicals in the preservatives in the wood might cause cancer and things like that. And what's that? Those preservatives are arsenic-based. Yeah. Well, you still see a pressure-treated lumber everywhere, though. I mean, yeah. Yeah, well, that's a long time ago. Yeah, it's 22, 21 years ago. But she's like scared to death of all this stuff, and I'm not even sure that causes cancer. I mean, there's a whole big literature on these cancer scares that seems to ignore the old saying that toxicologists have that the dose makes the poison. So when you read about these things that say this or that causes cancer, they haven't really proven that it causes cancer. They might feed the substance the equivalent to rats of, say, the human equivalent of 1,000 gallons a day for a year, and the rat develops a tumor, and then you'll see a big report in the New England Journal of Medicine that the substance in pressure-treated lumber may cause cancer. And that's sort of been the history of a lot of these studies of cancer. Because after all, if they knew what causes cancer, wouldn't they cure it? I mean, couldn't we cure it? Read Bruce Ames if you're interested in this. Bruce Ames is a biochemist at University of California, Berkeley, who has debunked a lot of this stuff. And check out junkscience.com also on the abuse of statistical analysis with all these cancer-causing agent claims, electromagnetic fields, and all that. Basically, what a lot of it does is to find a correlation between some substance and the incidence of cancer somewhere. And they play all sorts of statistical games. For example, you ought to have heard of the phrase cancer clusters. They'll find that maybe in southern New Jersey, let's say, there seems to be a cluster of cancer cases. And there are also a lot of high-power electric power grids in southern New Jersey, and they'll find some sort of correlation. But for one thing, if you ever took statistics, you know correlation is not causation. There are a lot of other things that could cause cancer or anything else. And also, if you took statistics, you know that if you widen the sample, the cluster disappears. And so there's a lot of deceit that goes on here, in that they purposely narrow the sample to find these so-called clusters, and then just assert that the cause is the cause they want it to be. So I'm highly suspicious of it. They've lied so many times. Acid rain. The federal government spent $600 million in the U.S. on a big study, a 10-year study of acid rain, and it hired scientists from all over the world: Oxford University, Stanford University. There were all the best soil chemists and scientists of all sorts from all over the world. And the scientists came to the conclusion that acid rain in America created no health problems to humans, and not even any environmental damage apart from spruce trees at very high altitudes in New England. They said it didn't affect the lakes in New England or the Adirondacks. Those lakes in the Adirondacks have been acidic naturally for many, many years. It had nothing to do with pollution or anything like that. And so, good news. They spent $600 million and found that there wasn't a problem. That was a disaster for Congress. When they spend that kind of money, they want an emergency, because that's what gives them power. You know, if these scientists say, no emergency, therefore Congress, go on vacation, they don't want that. So they did not even have the scientists present the study to a congressional committee at all. They didn't hear it. And the one scientist who I know personally, his name is Ed Krug, he's a PhD soil chemist from Rutgers, went on 60 Minutes, CBS television 60 Minutes, and Ed Bradley, the interviewer, who's still there, interviewed him about this study, because the CBS got wind of this study. And Ed Krug just explained to them what they found. He's a scientist, and he said that he explained how the Adirondack lakes, people remember there being fish there at one time. The explanation the science came up with was that as development moved through there 150 years ago and cut all the trees down, there was much more water flow into those lakes after rains, and it reduced the acidity fish lived. Then, as it all grew back, it maintained the natural floor that had existed for thousands of years of the forest and everything like that, and the lakes returned to their natural acidity, which they had had for thousands of years probably. And that's what the conclusion they came to. And they said even if there was an acidity problem in the Adirondack lakes, the way to solve it is just throw lime in them, just like you do in your garden. Throw lime in there. That's why you don't need a Clean Air Act that costs the economy $500 billion a year or something like that. But that's what Congress wanted. They wanted a new big law to regulate the whole economy. But anyway, Ed Krug, after he went out this, he's a naive soil chemist. He was pretty much blackballed from his profession. The EPA sent out a note, he showed me the note, to universities all over the place saying don't expect to get an EPA grants for your research if you hire Ed Krug. And so that's the sort of thing that goes on in the propagandization of about the environment. Okay, so that's just one example. Farmers on the farm, in the farm area, the government defines a farmer as anyone who sells $1,000 or more of food of any kind during a year. So if you had just a big garden and sold tomatoes and watermelons and things, you're a farmer. I think with livestock, if you own 2 or more kinds of livestock, you're officially listed in the statistics as a farmer, and that would include my friend who has 2 daughters who are 10 and 12, and she bought them each a horse, and they keep it at a stable out there, and the girls ride every weekend on a horse. She's a farmer because she owns two ponies for her daughters. And of course this enables the government to exaggerate the number of farmers, so whenever there's a farm crisis they can say there are 5 million farm families who are in desperate need of help, as opposed to the usual, the reality of it all. And so that's what official lies is about, this whole scam of lying to us about just about everything. The final thing I'll mention is political blackmail as a popular device. Let me find my article here. In a book that I would recommend on this topic of political blackmail is there's a book called Money for Nothing by Fred McChesney, who is a law professor at Northwestern. He used to teach at Emory University. I think he was at Chicago for a short while. He's at Northwestern now. And Money for Nothing, it's published by Harvard University Press. And it's about the phenomenon of laws or regulations that come about out of Washington, D.C., for which there appears to be no interest group pressure. There seems to be no interest group that lobbied for these laws or regulations. Sort of a whole category of laws and regulations that usually, when Congress passes a law, it's because somebody wanted this law. There had been a crusade for years, usually, by some interest group of some kind to get this new law passed. But there is a category of laws where there's no evidence, no trail of this. And so, why? He writes a whole book on why. Well, the explanation is that basically Congress will propose an onerous law or regulation, price controls on pharmaceuticals, let's say, or the regulation of your business in some sort of way that you know is going to cost you a lot of money, a tax, an excise tax on your product, which you know is going to hurt sales. And then it'll sit back and wait for you and everybody else in your industry to pour money into the Washington, D.C. in the form of campaign contributions. And then once they've collected enough cash, they'll withdraw the law. They'll say, never mind, we're not going to vote on it, or they'll rescind the regulation. And McChesney documents how Congress itself, members of Congress, call these types of laws milker bills, or cash cows. He quotes a California congressman as saying, a politician in need of campaign contributions has a bill introduced which excites some constituency to urge the legislator to work hard for its defeat, which is easily achieved, pouring funds into his campaign coffers. They also call them sometimes juicer bills, since they're designed to squeeze cash out of corporate coffers in return for not harming the corporation with these bad laws. And sometimes they refer to them as fetcher bills that fetch gobs of campaign cash. And one example he gave was during the early 90s when the Clinton administration proposed price controls on pharmaceuticals. And of course the pharmaceutical industry, which invested billions in the development of drugs, didn't want this. And then Representative Jim Cooper, who was the man in Congress who actually introduced the legislation on behalf of in cahoots with the Clinton administration, quote, received nearly $1 million in campaign contributions in the first 4 months of 1994 alone. And overall, campaign contributions in 93 were about a third higher than the previous non-election year of 91. And then once all this money was collected, the Clinton administration and Congress said, forget about it. So they didn't have price controls after all on pharmaceuticals. So that's sort of how that works. Congress authorized the Federal Communications Commission to put price controls on cable TV, and what that does is it guarantees that, and this law is renewed every year, Now, why do you think Congress would renew that law every year? Why not just pass the law saying the FCC can, it doesn't say it must, it says it can put price controls on cable. But what would be in it for a politician? Why would they want to have to deal with this every year? What's the... Okay, you are so cynical. Right. Well, that means every year the cable industry has to come back and bribe them to not put price controls on. So, whereas if they just passed the law and said FCC has this power, they don't get that. The same with the law regarding blood alcohol content, the legal blood alcohol content. It's renewed every couple of years. And so the beer industry and the whiskey industry, the liquor industry, constantly has to be in Washington lobbying and sending money to Congress to not reduce the legal blood alcohol content level, because they're against that. And so you see this all the time. If these laws are such good ideas, why can't they last at least 3 years anyway? Congress is always complaining about how busy they are. And so that's my last example of political entrepreneurship I wanted to offer you, because I've been studying and writing about Congress and politicians and how they operate for a good 20 years. I've written numerous books about the whole process. And if you just look at the nuts and bolts of what you call political entrepreneurship, it's clear to me that you can sometimes find good people in government, but they usually don't last that long. But the overwhelming majority are political entrepreneurs who are out to separate themselves from any kind of control from the public, which is just the opposite of what the will of the people story is, isn't it? They don't really serve the will of the people. They serve the will of special interests for the most part. And that's about all I wanted to say for now about this. I think we have 5 minutes or so for questions, answers, brilliant declarations, or anything like that. I think you had your hand up first there, and then...
I wonder if you could say anything about the Granger laws that were passed back in the railroad days, like regulated railroad companies.
Well, yeah, the Granger laws. The farmers were very politically potent in the Midwest and Upper Midwest in the late 19th century, and they got these laws called the Granger laws passed. What came out among the things that came out of that? I'll give you. There's one hallmark piece of regulation that comes to mind. That was the effect of this farmer political clout. Was the regulation of the price of grain storage. It's not directly related to railroads, but there's a famous Supreme Court case called Munn versus Illinois, 1887, I believe it was, or 1877. I think it was 1877. And there were two brothers named Munn, M-U-N-N, and they owned a grain storage business where the farmers would pay them to store their grain. And the farmers in Illinois had enough clout to have a price control law passed on grain storage for no other reason than they wanted the money. They wanted to essentially rob the Munn brothers. Instead of allowing the free market price for grain storage, they wanted a lower price, and they had the political clout to do it, so they did it. And previous to this, the Supreme Court was more protective of property rights and would not permit price control laws like this to happen. But things had been changing. As Hans mentioned, or I think it was Ralph mentioned in his speech 2 nights ago, after the American Civil War, America became committed to mass democracy, nationalism, and eventually imperialism. It was a different political climate altogether. And this was 1877, and the Supreme Court upheld this. And it was because of the clout of the farmers, essentially. And there's a famous quote, the judge in the case in the Illinois court said that, I can paraphrase it, that whenever a business affects the public interest, it must submit to be controlled by the public, meaning the government. And of course, every business affects the public. That's who you do business with, the public. And so it pretty much opened the door to any kind of regulation of business, if that was taken seriously. And it was the farmer, the Granger movement that started this. And with regard to the railroads, it was the same thing. They wanted to pay lower prices for rail service than what was being offered. And if they had the political clout to put price controls on rail services, they would do it. Vanderbilt was giving volume discounts. He gave a volume discount to John D. Rockefeller, for example, because Rockefeller was shipping thousands and thousands and thousands of barrels of refined kerosene on the railroads. And Vanderbilt made an open offer. He said, anybody who can match the volume of John D. Rockefeller will get the exact same price as John D. Rockefeller. And of course, the smaller farmers or smaller merchants thought they were being discriminated against by having to pay higher prices. And so they sought price controls. And this eventually did lead to a new law. But you know what the federal government did was they raised everybody's price. They made the lower discounts illegal, which didn't help the farmers at all and the small merchants. So they said, okay, we believe in equality, 14th Amendment and all that. So that didn't help them after all. I think you had your hand up. If we have another minute. Time for one.
You mentioned that some of these nonsense programs like WOOD were able to occur because of voter ignorance of their occurrence. Do you think that in general, if you were able to, and maybe it's politically impossible to occur, but if you're somehow able to accomplish a simpler tax code and more transparent accounting of the government expenditures, maybe through a website that anybody could go on and spend 2 hours and pretty much figure out who's paying what, where it's going, and what the general return on that revenue expense was. What do you think that would turn things in the better direction, or do you think the majority of people leeching on the minority providers would just get worse? Do you think it would eliminate some of the nonsense handouts?
Well, it could. Even if an enterprising journalist could be educated enough to do that sort of thing. Now, in the information age now, and you look at, but when I was doing all this research, and I used to go and get a hold of the federal budget, one of the first things I learned is no human being is capable of understanding the federal budget. There are some aspects of it that are summaries that are understandable, but it's impossible. They don't use accounting standards. They don't use official accounting standard of government. The SEC forces every business in America to use the official accounting standards that the government wants. That's what accountants have pretty much become, is sort of the servants of the Securities and Exchange Commission, at least the ones that work for corporations, and make sure they comply with all their laws. But the government doesn't use any of that. I suppose it's possible, but it'd be extremely difficult because the government's books, for example, the Pentagon has admitted that it has no idea where $150 billion is. Don't know what happened to it. And so.
If you could somehow get them to practice, simple accounting and make it available to the public, do you think that the public would, demand that some of this nonsense be eradicated, or do you think that it would just harm the majority with better information on how to?
Probably not. With my experience with the tax-funded politics, with the government giving money to interest groups, there are so many groups out there that benefit from all this that if a guy like you were to be successful in doing this and get on 60 Minutes with this, you would have 100 of these interest groups trying to destroy you personally. They would be waging a big campaign of character assassination against you, among other things, and just the mere volume of their voices, I think, would drown you out. Whenever the government enters into a debate, it has the ability to drown out all other voices. A government as big as ours in the U.S. anyway. And if a government is smaller, it doesn't have that advantage. But a government as big as ours has the ability to drown out all our voices. So I'm not optimistic about that. I suppose it could conceivably make an improvement. But I wouldn't be optimistic because the government is just too big. If we were separated into maybe 7, 8, or 9 separate republics in America, then it would be, that sort of thing would be more doable, I think. Say if the South seceded again, and you'd have a much smaller country, and it'd be more of a community, and so you would be more successful in doing this. But with this vast empire of ours, maybe time for one more, or are we out of time? No, we're out of time. The sound man says we're out of time, but I'll be glad to answer any questions or listen to your brilliant commentary.